Hello, welcome to an e-demo on the network configuration of an Illustra Essentials camera. First of all, what I'm going to do is just open up a web browser and I'm going to navigate to the IP address of my camera and I'm going to go ahead and log in as an admin user. Once the interface loads, I'm going to choose Setup and then I'm going to choose Network. And you'll see, once I select Network, there are a number of sub-options underneath there, the first of which is TCP/IP. It's in here where we can assign the IP address of this camera. So first of all, you'll see we have the host name of the camera on the network, and we can change that just by typing in the field. We then have the mode of IP address. So that's going to be DHCP or static. By default, this camera is set to DHCP. So if you have a DHCP server on your network and you want to use that to assign an IP address to this camera, you can keep that selected. Otherwise, you can choose static and you can manually enter the address there. You can also choose to use IPv6 or IPv4. Okay, so the next submenu then is called connection, and it's in here where we can set the maximum number of connections and we can set the ports for all of those protocols. We can also enable HTTPS communication there, and on the OnViv tab we can enable or disable authentication requirements for OnViv connections. Next we have PPPoE, or point-to-point protocol over Ethernet, and if you need to use that, you can enable it and you can enter your username and password there as you require. Then we have dynamic DNS. Again, if you need to use that, you can select the provider there and enter all of the required settings. Next we have an IP filter submenu. In here we can enter an IP or MAC address or an IP range to filter connections for. So let's take a look at how we do that. If I just choose this button here, you can see I can first of all choose do I want to filter by IP address, by IP segment, or by MAC address. You'll see the fields over on the right hand side there change as I make those selections. So let's just enter an IP address. If I choose save, you'll see that that IP goes into the table here. And what I can do to enable this feature is just check this trusted sites checkbox. And that means that only connections from these IP addresses will be allowed to this camera. And I can remove that IP from the table just by selecting the icon in the delete column and confirming the deletion. Okay, so next we have SMTP, which is our email server settings. So we can configure the email server there. We can select whether it's going to be an anonymous connection or if it requires authentication. And we also have an email test button at the bottom there as well. We have UPnP, which is universal plug and play. So we can set the settings there for that, and we can also enable it, and we can choose the mode of manual or automatic. Next we have Bonjour. If we want to use that, we can keep that enabled, and we can also change the server name there. Next we have multicast, so we can enable or disable that for each of our streams, so that's the main stream and the substream, and we can also enter the multicast address and ports there. Next we have 8021X, so we can choose the authentication protocol for that, and we can enable it as we require, as well as entering the logon credentials. And finally, we have quality of service, or QoS, and we can configure the settings in there as we require, and then choose save.